Hello, hello, hello. This is Taeyoon. Welcome to my apartment. I'm going to walk you through the process of preparing for my lecture at the University of Denver. So I'm teaching 3 classes this quarter, one of which is titled Computing Culture. It's a mix of a seminar and a workshop for undergraduate and graduate students. So far, I've assigned them my essay, which is called Where Would You Like to Place Your Pet Giraffe, which was published on an online magazine called Thing. And students were asked to write a response to the essay. The essay covers some of the key ideas about the relationship between cultural institutions, specifically museums, and the roles in which that museums have played in building and sustaining the colonial enterprises and empires. The students are a mix of computer science students, art history students, art students, and game design students. So it's a really interesting mix of different backgrounds and interests. So we got to know them a little bit. And the second week, I assigned them 2 writings, all of them criticism of contemporary artworks, of really leading artists and designers who are either actively working with and celebrating new technology such as artificial intelligence, and other artists who are really deeply critiquing and integrating some of the cultural and political fabrics in which these technologies exist and potential and real life harm that they are creating in our lived experiences. So we had a very optimistic artist and a very pessimistic artist that we were researching and getting to know. And I also did some of a lecture about AI and machine learning in the context of art because I wanted to give students a big, broad brush stroke of looking at colonialism, art, museums, and new technology. So in the next few weeks, I'm actually going to go slower, kind of coming back to the initial inquiry about the relationship between computing and culture. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about prehistories of computing. So the prehistories of computing is actually plural histories, the histories which are not often recorded or celebrated in computer science or even science and technology studies. And they're excluded or isolated because possibly they are not European, possibly they are not white, possibly they are not really considered as a history of computing in a strict technical sense. So the lecture is shaped in 10 different categories, which I call 10 micro lectures. And each lectures are going to contain very few slides and a few references. And I'm actually trying to not show them too much, but actually focus on creating the set of questions in which they can explore and give them the framework in which they can apply to the specific topics that they're interested in. So 10 micro lectures, some of which I have talked about or studied and shared as a teaching material while I was working at the School for Poetic Computation in New York City or New York University and a few other places that I've been teaching. And a lot of these are new. And although I do recycle some of the references and stories, it's always redesigning for the specific audience, which are my students and audience members. So now that I know a little bit about what they're interested in and where they're coming from, I'm actually more ready to custom design this lecture for them. So in this video, I'm gonna just walk you through how I put together my slides and lecture notes, and hopefully that's of interest for you, possibly people who are learning or people who are interested in teaching. Tell a little bit about how this lecture is going to be structured and how I'm planning to make the slides and materials for it. So the first is that it should be prehistories of computing culture. So because it's a precursor of the histories as we know, and it's also giving an impression about the possibilities of contra history, so alternate histories, because it's the stories that are not officially told from the books that we read. And also it's plural, so it's important that there are multiplicities. Of this computing culture. And that's more of a sort of the optics in which that I'm thinking about the lecture, is that looking back from today and seeing beyond the known histories and hopefully go farther and farther back to discover something. And in the process that we discover the multiple stories as opposed to singular origin story. The second part is the non-Western. This is quite obvious because the most of the histories of computing that we know center around people like Charles Babbage, Ada Lovelace, and Claude Shannon and Alan Turing, who are almost all European or American white people. And there's a reason that their stories are recorded and celebrated more so than, for example, stories of Islamic automata or ancient Chinese devices to understand the astronomy ancient. There are reasons why those stories are celebrated more so than, for example, stories of ancient Islamic automata or Chinese clocks or African accounting systems or different indigenous weaving systems. It just has to do with the ways in which that the modern world center around a certain capitalist power and their ways of understanding the world through their ancestors. So definitely a lot of non-Western precursors of computing. And a few things that I mentioned are like Islamic automata, indigenous weaving, and this approach is still relevant today because, for example, most of the code is written in English, and that's a intention of the people who designed the initial software. I mean, English is the most widely used languages, but it also does not need to be that all of the code are written in English. So a contemporary example of those critical approach to thinking about non-Western computing would be, for example, Arabic programming language. A couple of my friends have really inspired me to look into this. One of them are Nabil Hussain, and another person is Ramzi Nasser. So their work, sometimes thinking into different mathematical models in which the worldview of the Arabic speaking cultures have designed how that influenced the contemporary numbering and programming languages per se. And the other approach could be designing languages, programming fully programmable languages that are written in Arabic as opposed to alphabets. The third part is the concept of zero. So it's widely known that for certain part of the history in the Western world, the concept of zero was forbidden because the absence actually, when it's given form as a number, that could signal an absence of God. So absence, and using the absence as a placeholder and a marker in which other numbers could exist and coexist, that's a really innovative tool. And it's actually interesting how zero is not a natural number. It is actually arbitrary. It is designed so that we could actually use numbers. And this idea of an arbitrary number in which the symbolic mechanics depend on, I think that's actually really the key to understand how computing works on a granular level. So obviously it becomes 0, 1, the binary, the other types of abstraction. So number 4 is female programmers. I briefly mentioned Ada Lovelace, but there are also many others, Grace Hopper and others. And this is where it really gets interesting challenge of intersectionality and trying to articulate the relationship between representation and accountability. Because on the one hand, it's incredibly important to recognize and appreciate the female programmers, but it's also important to understand that they were part of a larger facilities, research and engineering, as well as a military operations that we are trying to investigate and try to understand the cultural impact of. So yes, there were female programmers, and yes, they were part of the larger military operations that had negative and some important impacts. So the intersectionality of how we see non-male programmers and engineers in the context of the larger operations research that they were part of. And number 5 is queer computing. It's really well known that Alan Turing was a queer person, and he was his life was cut short because of his gender by the British military, by the British government. And there are significant scholars today thinking and exploring the queerness in computing, as well as the queer pioneers that have been disregarded. And I think a few people that I can think about is Jacob Gaburi, who has really great publications on this subject matter, and also artist Zach Blass. I think that's how you write his name. But he has created really beautiful artworks investigating these queerness, body, and technology, and subversive ways in which the queer communities have championed interventions into the larger society. The next would be decolonizing computing. And this is a really exciting field. There are active scholars and activists thinking about decolonial praxis and philosophy and direct action in the context of computing. And this could mean investigating the ways in which the computing and data and software have always been used as a part of military operations, different kinds of surveillance that are created by the Western space, and also how that impacts the global South in a negative way. So to talk about decolonizing, it's really necessary to talk about colonizing and different ways that the colonizing corporates and empires have employed computing is through big data, surveillance, resource extraction, and e-waste, and infrastructure. So in the forms of either telecommunication, transportation, or data centers, or more invisible approach of, just buying up the bandwidth of different ways, different bandwidth for telecommunication, or Facebook trying to build internet on all of the India. So those be the kind of things that are colonizing force behind the internet. But decolonizing approach it's actually a very diverse field and very active in defining itself and also implementing real life changes. So, for example, activists trying to use to make internet available for indigenous people in the global South, people trying to build servers and data centers that are independent from the big tech companies. So decolonizing practice and technology is really the key, in my personal view, about sort of the urgent task that I see that needs to be done. So 7 is the internet. And in the next 2 chapters, I talk about the difference between internet and the World Wide Web. And how internet as a infrastructure for long-distance telecommunication has been developed even before what we know as like the kind of the decentralized networks that became the internet. So thinking about colonial communication protocols, different ways that telegram and telephone and kind of mailing services or railroads were part of the infrastructure that became the internet of today. And looking into how that has not changed so much. So this access to physical space and kind of the expansionist approach of going to the West or trying to find new spaces for colonizing, that has always been part of the internet's protocol. The World Wide Web, that's actually different from the internet, although it builds on top of the physical infrastructures of the internet and the protocols. And here I'm actually going to talk specifically about sort of like the utopian visions of the early web and how the cyberspace was seen as the potential third public space. And some of the disappointments that have happened because of the commercialization, because of the corporatization, and also the colonial approach that how these corporations have executed their businesses. So there's utopia, dystopia, and again, another utopia. So it goes back and forth. I think this one is especially interesting because it relates to some of the big conversations around crypto currencies, NFT, and other things that were really big a few years ago. And we're at a really interesting point on the year of 2024 where a lot of the hype is gone, and some of the worst things have already been happened, but also perhaps this is a beginning of a more grounded approach of thinking about the utopian, dystopian, and something else, something beyond. maybe that's practical. So the web is always changing, it's growing, and it's our job to really understand what the harm that it can do and also the positive things that it can bring. So 9 is Rhodes Colossus, and then the savior myth. So Rhodes Colossus, there's this really incredible image of white European extending the telecommunication in the African continent, and that's really the symbol of how the inventors and the investors thought of themselves when they are going into the global south and colonizing them. And it's really interesting to see how the tech entrepreneurs and the tech evangelists also see themselves as an enabler and also the savior of certain social conditions. And there are a lot of readings about the savior myth and how that is really baked into the ways in which that we think about education and empowerment through technology, and how that is such an easy sell to obscure some of the realities of how the technologies are created and used. So we'll definitely look at the savior myth. And last is the cultural analysis approach. So cultural analysis approach is this class is designed as artistic and creative interpretation of computing culture. So I've been asking students to write essays in a few different formats in hope that this prepares them to do really rigorous cultural understanding of technical subject. So cultural analysis could take form of personal narrative, it could be interview, it could be reorganizing the archives and trying to see what else you could tell from the stories of the archives. And it could also be fictional or mix of a fact and fiction. So I think I'm open for various ways that the students write about this subject matter, but I want to make sure that there is a methodologies in which that they're following, and that to me is the cultural analysis approach. So that's sort of the, in a nutshell, 10-piece structure of the class. And yeah, the assignment for them in the end of the quarter is to write a piece in the topic of computing culture and publish that on a digital form and on a print form. So a bit like a zine. So I'm hoping to make that available for the internet, for the wider audience to see. Next week, I'm going to look at Tara McPherson's mid-century Fordism. And I'm also going to be looking into initial proposal from the students. So we're going to be collecting those research topics and giving them some time to publish that as a work in progress. So mid-century Fordism, that's a really amazing book or essay that I read that I keep coming back to. So I'll make a note of that essay as well. Yeah, one thing that I forgot here is Gunalan Nadarajan, who's a scholar who wrote really amazing essay about the Islamic automata, which I'll also link. I think that's actually a really good piece for everyone to read. And yeah, this is another overview of the class and some of the research that I have been doing. A lot of these have been published either as essays or talks or artworks in the past and scattered around the world and also on the internet. I'm trying to be intentional about bringing those together, making them more accessible and more permanent, because I also see my thoughts changing and I'm just losing track of where they are. So I'll be publishing more of these videos this year, hopefully in a textual format very soon as well. So, bye. Okay, so that was the first 25 minutes of the lecture preparation. I basically went through the ideas that I had, the work that I've already done, and restructured them. The next step is to find all the resources that I'm talking about, all the essays and projects, so that I can show to students. And because it's more of an intimate class of 18 students as opposed to 100-person lecture, I'm going to take it more casually, so I might just pull out some links as I'm speaking, give them time to see it, ask questions. That's different from more of a formal lecture. And I've actually really prefer to mix slide and kind of a live searching and sharing at the same time. I think that actually gets students more engaged. So I'll do that tomorrow. I do have some slides that I'm going to use, but I think I might put together these bullet points into Keynote and then link to other essays and projects. So that will be a second video because that's another phase. But yeah, thanks for watching. And I'm just trying to work in the public because it's encouraging. And I think it will inspire me to be more diligent about writing and sharing and giving credit to those I'm inspired by. So, hope you have a good night.